Hello! Today I'm going to be talking about nerve impulses. The nervous system consists of the brain, spinal cord, and all of the nerves in the body. Together, these are responsible for controlling and activating every movement and function in our body. There are three types of neurons: unipolar sensory neurons, bipolar interneurons, and multipolar motor neurons. The structure of all three neurons have the same four parts to them. Dendrites are tree-like extensions of neuron cell bodies that form the information receiving network for the neuron. Axons are fiber-like extensions of a neuron by which the cell sends information to target cells. The cell body is the house of the nucleus, and the axon terminals are enlarged axon endings used to make contacts with other nerve cells or effector cells. Sensory neurons are also known as afferent pathways because they receive information and transmit it to the inner neuron. Motor neurons are called efferent pathways because they send impulses from inner neurons to muscles and glands. Reflexes are rapid involuntary responses to stimuli conducted through the three neurons we just talked about to form a reflex arc. First of all, when you touch something hot, your initial response is to pull away. We are going to look at how and why this happens. The effector of the sensory neuron reacts to the stimulus of the fire. The sensory neuron then conducts nerve impulses along an afferent pathway. The nerve impulse is passed to the inner neuron, then to the motor neuron, and it conducts nerve impulses along an efferent pathway. The effector either contracts a muscle or secretes a product of a gland. Now let's get more in depth. When a neuron is stimulated, it starts a process called action potential. This happens along the axon of a neuron. Along the axon membrane, there are sodium-gated and leak channels, also potassium-gated and leak channels. Inside the membrane, there is a negative charge due to more potassium ions than sodium ions, and on the outside, there's a positive charge. The leak channels are the only transport open during the resting potential. The neurons can only be stimulated during this time. When the axon is stimulated, this causes the depolarization phase. Sodium-gated channels open up, and sodium ions rush inside the membrane. This makes the inside of the membrane temporarily positive. The next phase is repolarization, when potassium-gated channels open up and send potassium rushing out to make the charge back to negative on the inside. When the threshold is reached, hyperpolarization occurs. The axon cannot be stimulated during this time. Potassium and sodium-gated channels close. This is also known as the refractory period because the axon has to reset in order to be stimulated again by sending 3 sodium ions out and 2 potassium ions in. This is the 3-to-2 ratio. Once the membrane is reset, it enters resting potential and now can be stimulated again. The thing is to realize that this happens all around the circumference and down the axon. Now let's look at how action potentials are transferred from one neuron to the next. A process called synaptic transmission allows the signals from one neuron to another by jumping across a tiny space or synapse. There is a presynaptic neuron, the neuron sending the signal, and a postsynaptic neuron, the neuron receiving the signal. When the action potential reaches the axon terminal, calcium channels open and calcium ions rush into the neuron. Inside the axon terminal, there are vesicles with neurotransmitters stored inside them. The calcium binds to the vesicles. The vesicles carry neurotransmitters towards the presynaptic membrane. The neurotransmitters are then released and diffused across the synaptic cleft. The neurotransmitters then bind to the receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, which activates them. Through diffusion, the receptors allow sodium in the neuron, causing an action potential to start in the postsynaptic neuron. The neurotransmitters are released from the receptors and diffused back into the synaptic cleft. Vesicles recycle some of the neurotransmitters to prepare the neuron for the next action potential. This is a great opportunity to mention how drugs are bad because they will mess with the normal function of the neurons. The drugs mimic neurotransmitters that can overstimulate or inhibit the cell. Next, I will explain 2 more concepts that go hand in hand. First are excitatory postsynaptic potential and inhibitory postsynaptic potential interneurons. The two different potentials are caused by neurotransmitter chemicals that can be depolarizing for EPSPs or hyperpolarizing for IPSPs. Hyperpolarization is when it inhibits action potential by increasing the stimulus required to remove the membrane potential to the action potential threshold. Many times more than one EPSP is needed to activate action potential. Plus, if there are two of each EPSPs and one PSPs, they cancel each other out. So the sum of the EPSP has to be greater than the IPSP to activate action potential. Nerve pools are how neurons are connected and organized. There are two types, convergent and divergent. Convergent is when multiple sources provide information for one source. Divergent is when one source provides information for multiple sources. Between each type of neuron, there can be different nerve pools going on. Finally, let's piece all this together through a reflex arc. Receptors pick up the stimulus like the fire. The afferent sensory neuron starts the action potential down the axon. When it reaches the axon terminal, synapses transmission starts to pass the action potential to the inner neuron. The inner neuron then goes through action potential. There may be multiple inner neurons, so this nerve pole relationship would be divergent. Depending on if the sum of the EPSPs are greater than the IPSPs, the action potential will be then passed along to the motor neuron. Through synapses transmission, the nerve pole relationship is convergent. The motor neuron goes through action potential and synapses transmission to a muscle or gland to carry out a function, like moving away from a hot surface. The nervous system is responsible for every movement in our body that happens so fast and involuntarily. Thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something new.